Argentina has defaulted for the second time in 13 years. What are the implications for the world and for the country? With me to discuss this is Joseph Cotterill, a writer for Lex and Alphaville. Joe, it's a long, complicated story, but very briefly, tell us, how did we get to this situation?
Well, if history repeats itself, this isn't so much an economic crisis as in 2001 as a courtroom farce. We have to look at what Argentina has defaulted on, and it's the debt which it restructured after the first default 13 years ago. It's always been in default on the creditors who held out from that restructuring, who over the last 13 years have been trying to enforce those debts by hook or by crook in US courts. 2 years ago, they won quite a big victory, and Argentina's response since then has been to essentially prevaricate until it's decided to default on everyone rather than paying holdouts and restructured.
In the end, it came down to quite a big confrontation in US courts between hedge funds and the country. Could it have been averted, this default? A lot of last-minute talks went on last night.
Yeah, I mean, there were all sorts of rumours, for example, that Argentine banks would come in and make a private sort of side payment to the holdouts in order to allow talks to continue. But essentially, it's really been Argentina politically does not want to pay these holdouts. It passed laws, years ago not to pay them.
Okay, so what are the implications then for Argentina now? Economic disaster for the country?
Well, actually, you have to look at the bond prices for both restructured and holdout debts, and they're quite high, and they're roughly the same. About 80 cents in the dollar each, which implies that Argentina is actually going to make a settlement quite soon. I mean, at stake here is having free sort of unfettered access to capital markets, which is quite important for Argentina.
Which is going to be a big deal for its economy going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's devalued its currency, earlier this year. If it wants to avoid another one, it needs to have access to US dollar financing, and the holdouts are really the last obstacle.
Okay, all right. Let's look at the broader implications, if you like. Is this going to be a shock to financial markets globally?
Well, I mean, ever since the 2001 default, really, there hasn't been that much exposure in banking and finance to the Argentine sovereign for obvious reasons, because it defaults all the time.
It was no surprise.
Yes, but other sovereigns probably have to look at the legal protections in their own debt issuance to make sure that, if they ever restructure in the future, holdouts won't have the same leverage.
But some of that's been taking place already, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, you have to consider, Ecuador, has recently issued debt, and, that's another serial defaulter. And if you look at the terms there, they aren't hugely protective for creditors and, may lead to interpretation issues down the line if it defaults again. So you have to kind of constantly look at what the bond contracts say.
Okay. Of course, the emphasis in the sort of bond sovereign market the last few years has been Europe, but we have seen legal changes there. Have they learned perhaps from the Argentine experience?
Yeah, the innovation in Europe was to introduce collective action clauses, which essentially the majority votes and then they bind the minority so that holdouts never become a problem in the first place. And I expect, again, people should be sort of broadening collective action clauses. However, they're not a wonder weapon for sort of solving these debt restructuring issues. The thing you have to decide on in the first place is the debt restructuring fair? Argentina's in 2005 was, extremely punitive. And you have to kind of look at, what's reasonable. Okay,
Joe, you've watched this very closely over the years. What should we watch out for in the next weeks and months ahead?
I mean, we have to look at if Argentine banks do make that sort of private deal, but also we have to think, in the next few months, we'll be sort of pushing towards the settlement. That's what I think bond prices are telling us.
Joe, thank you very much. So lots to watch out for there in the case of Argentina and its second default in 13 years. For more information, do go to ft.com.